you very much. I'm not at all intimidated by the room, the people, and the expectation that I'm going to be able to answer all of your questions. First of all, why on earth am I talking about men when Catalyst's vision is workplaces that work for women? Well, that's because we firmly believe that workplaces that work for women work for everyone. And those of you who know science, and this is about as science as I'm going to get this afternoon, know that a catalyst is an agent of change. And the change that we want is change not just for the few, but it has to be embedded in company values and culture. And therefore, it cannot be only determined by women. So that's why I've gone slightly rogue on my speech title as well. It was very specific, and I've widened it a little.
Sorry.
That's okay. It was decided upon a good 3/4 of a year ago. So what I'm going to talk about today is women and men partnering on real change. And I will touch on everything that was mentioned in the original title, I promise. So we'll look at privilege and mentoring and so on and so forth. I'm going to also try not to talk too long, because I know there are quite a lot of questions from the audience. So I'll try and deal with those as well. I've just suddenly thought, there's my clicker, I can see it. Okay, that's good. Let me tell you a little bit about Catalyst briefly. We are a non-profit organization working globally. We've got about 55 years of history behind us, and originally started looking specifically at how women could get into jobs back in the 60s in the US, where typically women had to stop work after marriage. But over the years, we've moved on to do more and more research and continuously advocacy work in particular with major businesses, major corporations, to advance the place of women in the workplace. And so that now we're an organization with around about 800 supporter organizations. We're still very much a non-profit organization. So although we provide a lot of services for our supporting members, who are typically organizations such as Accenture, who you've heard from today, we also have a mission to talk to other institutions like ours, institutions like yours, and so I'm delighted to be here today talking to you about the work that we do. I'm actually going to start with some research for a research organization that's not ours. But this was a piece of research done by Boston Consulting Group last year. At the beginning of this year, in which they showed that companies trying to advance for women in the workplace were much more successful when men were involved. And in fact, I think they were looking at around about a difference of 96% progress to about 30% of progress to organizations where men weren't actively involved in inclusion and diversity initiatives. And we see the same thing happening in our own work. And to be honest, how can it be otherwise when it's traditionally men who hold power in organizations? We see, for example, that around about 76% of women think that gender stereotyping within their workplace is a barrier to their progress, whereas less than 50% of men agree with them. What I want to look at today briefly with you is why we need cross-gender partnerships to drive women's empowerment and inclusion at work. And I'm saying specifically work, but I do believe genuinely that a lot of the work that we do with corporations can be entirely replicated in the academic world as well as other fields. What the barriers are typically for men getting involved in inclusion and diversity initiatives, what the benefits are to them as individuals, not just to the organization, and what men can do to help create inclusive workplaces. Just to sort of set the scene, I want to quote from a piece of research and writing from a lady, Joanne Lippman, who published some work this year. And not being critical, but I'm very used to talking to audiences which are mainly made up of women. But if I carry on talking to audiences which are mainly made up of women, talking to half a gender, you only get half a conversation. and within that you also only get half a solution. So that's really why I think it's absolutely important that we try and get out there and talk to as many men as possible. So where are we at the moment? Where is Catalyst in terms of our research on engaging men in gender? You may have seen Ulf Schneider last year talking about Mark. Ulf is the CEO of Parexel, a German technology company based in Berlin, and he talked on our behalf about the work that Parexel is doing with us. Basically, back in 2009, we started doing research about men and their involvement in gender and inclusion initiatives. And we looked at a number of different organizations that we were working with, Rockwell Automation in particular, to see what was the kind of things that we were seeing in organizations where men were beginning to be more involved and more active in D&I work. And what we saw, for example, was companies reporting a decrease in gossip, companies reporting more open conversations, companies seeing, obviously, therefore, excellent results in terms of women moving through the ranks of their organization. Within that whole framework of research, in 2011, we launched MARC, which stands for Men Advocating Real Change. It began as a web platform, a community where men could have honest conversations with other men about some of the questions that they may have had around inclusion and diversity initiatives, around gender at work, and why it was important for them, why it was important for them to be champions, and so on and so forth, and how that could come about. And then from that point, we launched in 2014 the Mark Leaders program, originally a program which we gave only to men. But where we are now in 2018 is sort of a new iteration of Mark Leaders. It's a program that we give within companies, within typically our member companies, a very immersive experience, so very different from typical D&I trainings. We generally take a couple of days to sort of beat people down and then build them up again, give them plenty of time for self-reflection. And address within that immersive situation. And now we bring women into the conversation as well. What it's like to be a man in business, what maybe some of the sort of issues of male privilege that can affect women in business. And we spend a long time working with the people that we're training to help them sort of go through all of the phases of anger as they come through to acceptance. And then the idea is obviously that we give them plenty of things that they can act upon when they go back into the workplace. And Mark, we describe really as a movement. The idea is then that organizations who go through the training with us will be able to roll that out into their own organizations. So it's not something that we exclusively deliver. But what we do is we kind of give the top notes, as it were, and then we let the organizations that we work with take it on and make it their own. And I think probably as a small non-profit organization, that would be true for most of the work that we do. We give people the wherewithal, but we don't necessarily do it for them. There has to be some kind of making it their own for them to be able to roll with it, take it, modify it. And you see, for example, within that, companies like Dell and like Procter & Gamble producing their own programs whereby they cascade down knowledge through their organizations through different male champions. So that's really a little bit of what we're doing within the Mark Leaders program. One very important thing to mention is what I'm referring to here as dialogue versus debate. We see very strongly, both through our research and through our practical work, that when you engage in debate about the differences of gender and how that plays out in the workplace, it doesn't really get anybody anywhere. And I've learned this through my own professional development in this field as well. And I was saying to someone at lunch how I used to get so very angry about a lot of the inequalities that I was seeing and hearing about from our supporters, from our members. And over the years, I've learned to use that anger and have a dialogue more about it. And so we encourage, for example, in our training sessions, people to listen inclusively. So that might be humbly listening, assuming the good intent of the person that they're listening to, allowing them to say the things that they want to say without fear of judgment, and yet at the same time being able to have the space to say the things that you want to say as well. And I think that's a very important and really quite a difficult skill when you get into areas which can be touchy, which can be taboo, surrounding diversity, such as gender, such as sexuality, such as race, and so on. So that's really where the Mark Leaders program is coming from. But where it's based and what we started looking at in terms of the research is what we were actually seeing, why weren't men getting involved? And particularly, and it probably comes as no surprise, one big barrier is fear. Fear of being judged by other men, fear of making mistakes, and of also being blamed for mistakes made in the past. But in particular, now that issues of sexual harassment are being talked about much more openly, which I think is an excellent thing. I think of the fear of how quickly male privilege can be lost, how quickly it can be taken away. So a number of fears going on, but also at the same time degrees of ignorance and apathy. Almost 3/4 of the men that we asked at a certain point said that gender issues didn't concern them. Whereas, we're obviously all perfectly aware that male is also a gender. That they didn't relate to what they saw happening at work, to what they saw in their personal lives, the dynamics of their families, and they didn't really see or understand a lot of the difficult experiences that were happening for women day to day in their workplace. So as a result of these barriers, men very often feel blamed, or they operate from the sidelines. They can also be unlikely to support other men or intervene with other men when they see inappropriate behavior or things that they don't think is the right way of doing something. They may have their authority questioned, their authenticity questioned. Start to think in this kind of win-lose mentality rather than win-win. So if I give opportunities for women in the workplace, ergo I take opportunities away from myself. And then probably the most difficult one to deal with is that they switch off and they disengage with the whole conversation about inclusion and diversity. So, all that bad news, what can we actually do about it? What influences change in men, and how can they be encouraged to become champions for inclusion at work? Well, again, we did some research about this, and we noticed a couple of really key things. One in particular was this idea of defying masculine norms, getting away from sort of stereotypical male behavior. If you have men in your team who are prepared to do that, then that's a good step. In particular, men having women mentors, having professional relationships with women, whereby they're able to talk about the differences and talk about the different lenses of gender and how we experience them during the day. So maybe sponsor relationships or mentor relationships, both ways, both help. But in particular, there was one very key aspect that we saw was really, really important when predicting whether men in your team are going to be male champions who are really going to stand up and champion D&I in your organization. And that's based on a sort of innate sense of fair play. So if you have people in your team who really come from a standpoint of fairness, and often, very often based on personal experiences that they've had, negative personal experiences, then that very often predicts their propensity to be a champion for inclusion and diversity at work. So that's the kind of thing that you need to be looking at when you want to use males, men in your organization to be visible and vocal in their advocacy of women and inclusion efforts in general. Get them talking, preferably without slides, so talking in the coffee corners, at the end of meetings, and about their own personal experiences, and get them intervening with other men as well when they see behavior that they don't think is acceptable. So that's really sort of some of the key findings from our research. What are the benefits that men report? We all know about, I hope we all know about the benefits of the business case. Things like correlations between diverse teams and better performance, and so on and so forth. And however far I try and get away from the business case conversation, it generally comes up at some point in a conversation. But what are the benefits that men that we talk to report? Well, we saw, for example, in the groups that we interact with, they were talking about better physical health, having more rewarding relationships at home, and with their children, for example, being able to kind of parent in a way that they felt suited them as an individual rather than suited them as a gender. Freedom to be themselves, not complying to a particular gender norm. And last but not least, the freedom to share financial responsibility for the family unit as well, which has got to be a good thing, surely. Now, we wouldn't be Catalyst if I weren't giving you loads of actions, because that's one of the things that I hope we specialize in the most. We offer a number of tools that our supporters can use that go along with our research, but we also offer a number of tools to non-supporting organizations like yours, so please feel free to take a photo, but I'll tell you how to get hold of these kind of documents in a minute. Many of the things that we would do, for example, we would encourage men to take responsibility for themselves. It's not just that women have to be the people who are telling men how to get involved in diversity and gender initiatives. Like I said before, male is a gender too. Be open, share and communicate your support for women in your workplaces. Talk to other men about your experiences as you become a champion for diversity and inclusion. Intervene with other men. This is an important one. Showcase using flexible work arrangements. What we see very often, flexible work arrangements are essential for women because unfortunately still they're traditionally the ones who are balancing work and family. But at the same time, when men stand up and say, oh, by the way, guys, I'm just leaving the office now because I'm going to pick the kids up, or I'm going to look after my mum, she's not feeling very well. When men make those conscious interventions and showcase using flexibility, it makes an enormous amount of difference for women in the workplace, and it's a great role model behavior for other men in the workplace. I think you'd be surprised when you find out how many men coming up through the organizations would like to break away from the very kind of narrow path that they're expected to lead in terms of, responsibility for work versus responsibility for family. So that's a very important thing. I mentioned it already, get involved as men in mentoring relationships with women. And particularly, now that sexual harassment is such I was going to say issue in the workplace, but it's always been an issue in the workplace, such an issue that we know about now in the workplace, that we're talking about in the workplace, that it's something we need to be open about. So be open in your mentoring relationships, be transparent in your mentoring relationships. Don't just mentor women, but men sponsor women as well. The deans of you out here, find your high potential women in your organization and open the door for them. Help them get in to the top roles that help women advance within senior management. What else? Yeah, be attentive to judgment systems within your organization. Make sure that men and women are being promoted on the same standards, are being assessed on the same standards, are being interviewed on the same standards, and avoid that bias creeping in as it so often does. And finally, of course, speak up, talk, be open. Talk about all of the experiences that you're having. Have the courage to have those courageous conversations, those difficult conversations. And when you do it in a dialogue format, that you know that it's not a competition to see who can get it right or wrong, that makes it very much easier. Almost at the end, almost at the time of many questions. I wanted to share this quote. I'm not a big fan of quotes, but I like this one in particular. I have two teenage daughters, and I've been very aware of how we raise them and the multitude of choices and options that they have ahead of them. And I've been very aware of how actually fantastically open my parents were with me and my brother as I was growing up. We've seen an enormous amount of progress in the way that we raise our daughters, but I would encourage those of you with sons to be as brave and offer them the full spectrum of emotions and give them the choices that you may not have had when you were growing up. I think that would be a wonderful step to give them a greater range of behaviors than maybe their fathers or their grandfathers were offered. So some homework for you when you get home tonight, or when you have had too much coffee at the end of the conference and can't get to sleep. You can have a look at onthemark.org, which is our brother webpage, catalyst.org and onthemark.org. You can even become a member of the On the Mark community. However, if you're a woman and you want to become a member of the Mark community, you have to bring 3 other men with you. Sorry.
That's good.
We need to have these conversations across the genders, and Mark is a great safe space where men can start to have those conversations. So women, you're allowed in, but men, you're more allowed in. Just to finish off, Catalyst has got all sorts of different places and means and ways of you getting in touch with us. And I'd be delighted to hear from all of you if you want to find me by LinkedIn or whatever, to answer any questions you might have. I started at the beginning by saying workplaces that work for women work for everyone. I really do truly believe, and I think the organization believes as a whole, and that's why we're really very strongly driven by our mission, that if we can affect this change, if we can bring men into the conversation, we can see that the successes that we've been having up until now are really beginning to bring rewards to the organizations that we work with. It's small steps. It's patience. One of the things I've learned in the work that I've done is to have enormous levels of patience. I think I'll probably still be working in 55 years' time on this subject. Catalyst certainly will be. But hopefully that will be a place where many more men are in the conversation. And it's, you know, something when we don't just think gender, think woman, race, think black, sexuality, think homosexuality, but we bring all of those sides into the discussion. Hopefully we've got some time.
We have a little bit of
some
time.
questions.
I have a feeling there will be some questions. So here's the first
I'll do my
one.
best to answer them.
Yeah.
I hope you don't mind. I'm going to take questions one at a time, because otherwise I'll forget.
I don't know if there'll be many during the day. Just here with the mustard jacket. There we go.
Thank you. So it was really inspiring. My name is Anne, and I'm from the University of Luxembourg.
Okay.
And I'm in charge of the transferable skills for doctoral candidates. And I was wondering if you've done such kind of trainings for doctoral candidates, but only men.
We don't tend to do much work in academic fields, but we certainly have done. I think one of my colleagues took a group at the University of Limerick last year. So we do some work in academic fields. It's not an incredibly budget-friendly training. So that tends to be, and would you believe it, also in major corporations, that tends to be an issue. It's transformational stuff, it's an investment. And I think most of you know, as D&I professionals, Rome wasn't built in a day. It's an ongoing, long-term process of financial investment, but also investment in terms of, changing your programs, taking a different approach, moving another way. So it's not something I'd rule out, absolutely not. Okay.
Just another question.
I have the next question. We intended in the Council of the European Union to have an event on International Men's Day on the 19th of November.
Yeah.
And their motto this year is finding role models.
Yeah.
And that's the big problem.
Yeah.
Where would you start?
Give me a call. Okay. I've got role models for you. I can absolutely.
But internal role models.
Well, I think.
Because
then,
I mean, taking the equal opportunities officer would be the easy option.
Yeah.
No, I mean everyone expects me to look after my children and work part time.
Yeah.
And so if I go out and say, okay, I do that, they say, no, obviously.
Yeah.
How do you spot the people who might not necessarily speak up and say, I do that because I'm not proud of it, I do it because it's normal?
Try and find those men with that innate sense of fairness. I think that's a good place for you to start looking. Try and frame the conversation. If you had a talk with your departmental heads, for example, and find out from them, hey, who are the men who are young fathers, or who are the men who you see being flexible, who are the men who aren't here at 7 o'clock in the evening. Those are the kind of signals that you can start looking for, and I think have conversations. You'll find they're there, and it will snowball at some point. Thank you.
Yeah, I have another question just back at.
Yes.
Yeah.
If you could tell us your name and where you're from.
I am Maria Mantini Satta from Bologna, Centro Studi Progetto Donna e Diversity Management. We have been working on gender equality for 30 years.
Yeah.
We know very well Catalyst.
Good.
Their products, very interesting and supporting. And in particular, your work with men. Yeah. And we experience a lot of what you have said in enterprises. But there is one sentence that I'd like you to explain better, because it's it has surprised me. The sentence, raise a daughter like sons. I mean, I don't think that you can believe that we have to raise our daughters like sons. I think that we have to raise our children to be free, to be able to recognize stereotypes, and so on. But as it is written, it can give another idea.
Yes.
We don't want daughters to be raised like sons.
No, absolutely, no. And thank you for that. I appreciate that. It's the idea of allowing people to be themselves. And yeah, thanks very much.
Yeah, and just one last one, because I've pretty much run out of time, but quickly.
Great, thank you. Great presentation. Gertie Parhar, Executive Dean at University of British Columbia from Vancouver, Canada. Loved your concepts and hope to implement a lot of them. I guess my one sensitivity is, by having the males speak up more, are we in any way disempowering the role of women and females in our organizations? That's the only sensitivity I would have.
Yeah, no.
And how do you get around that?
It's a really good question, and I think again it's this iteration of the model. This is why we moved from the original Mark Leaders program, which was only men, and when we moved it here into Europe, we got very clear feedback from our members here in Europe. That's not what we want to do. We need to bring everybody in. And so you need to strike a balance. But also within the same thing, and you might enjoy some of our research and our tools in particular on inclusive leadership, particularly listening to how the culture is going at your place of study. This idea of being able to admit mistakes as well. Where has it gone wrong in the past? Where do we want to go, and how are we going to get there? It's really... It's an odd concept, I think personally, that we're expected to get everything right all the time. It's not something I've ever managed is probably not something that many of you have ever managed. And it's something that I would discourage, for example, in my family. We do not have to be perfectionists. And within this work, it's going to be highly unlikely that we're going to get it right first time. And the next time that we do it, it may have repercussions as well. I had a really interesting discussion last week with a number of our supporters about intersectionality issues within their own environment. So what do you do if you're faced with an employee who's on the autism spectrum, who says something that's unacceptable about women? And yet you're an inclusive workplace. And a lot of D&I experts with me at the table saying, oh, that's really difficult. I don't know what I would do. And at a certain point you have to say,
good conversation.
Enough is enough. And that's not the way we're going as an organization. So it's very much, customization, doing what's right for your culture, and changing it again and again and again and again. I'm afraid.
Sounds like a conversation to keep going later on. Thanks so much. We're over time, but thank you for that. Thanks so much.